Hi there, this is my commentary on Chapter 9 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. In Chapter 8, Pirsig gave us an argument for the superiority of his metaphysics, or at least the greater inclusivity of his metaphysics, in showing us how it could reconcile some of the deep-seated problems that subject-object metaphysics either explains away or ignores, and he called these platypi. And for me, and I think looking at the comments on the reading of Chapter 8 and the commentary, 8 was a very exciting and compelling chapter for myself and for others. I think it's one of the best. It also helped us understand how quality creates subjects and objects, especially with the hot stove example, and that is a concept that's difficult to understand, and it's probably, it's really way up there in terms of importance. Maybe it's the most important concept in terms of practical application. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in this chapter, but this chapter really shows us how the metaphysics of quality was understood by Pheadrus to consist of two types of quality, how this is not a dualism, and how they need each other, and gives us some excellent and concrete examples on how these two versions of quality work together. It will also introduce the notion of the brujo, the catalyst of change. In any hierarchy of metaphysical classification, the most important division is the first one, for this division dominates everything beneath it. If this first division is bad, there is no way you can ever build a really good system of classification around it. So that's a universal rule that applies to metaphysics and everything else. Pheadrus realizes that he can't complain about subject-object metaphysics without introducing a better metaphysics. And this is an obvious insight that seems to elude most of the public today, who do enjoy carping about what's bad without offering solutions. It seems to be something we're subject to all the more these days, so the statement hits home, and we are very glad that Pheadrus knows this. The first thing to know is that in order for something to be functional at all, it can't just be an inert void, which is what the mystical understanding of reality is, experiencing the one, let's say. And if you characterize the one as something like inert potential or consciousness or the totality of reality, then then you have made it a concept, and you will have no choice but to start to cut into that concept. That's just how we roll as the thinking human beings we are. Look what we keep trying to do to consciousness. This is an ongoing discussion in philosophy. The Hindu mysticism, Advaita Vedanta, they don't cut into consciousness. They just are there experiencing the one, consciousness in the moment. So that's a perfect example of the mystical and rational approach to the same thing. So there's an obvious problem. Once you articulate something, it's no longer mystical. It's not only experiential, it's objectified. However, if something is not articulated, it can't be discussed, pondered over, or used in any meaningful way in normal life. So in order to propose a metaphysics to counter subject-object metaphysics, Pheadrus has to bring quality onto, as he calls it, the dialectical chessboard. And it's a great term. It means you have to put it in a place in which you start moving it around in a rational way, figuring out how it's going to be categorized and used. And another word for this action, of course, is the rational knife. The use of the term quality sets up a pile of questions of its own that have nothing to do with mystic reality and walks away leaving them unanswered. Even the name quality was a kind of definition, since it tended to associate mystic reality with certain fixed and limited understandings. Already he was in trouble. Was the mystic reality of the universe really more imminent in the higher priced cuts of meat in the butcher shop? These were quality meats, weren't they? So what do you think about that question? Do quality meats have quality? I think this question perfectly illustrates how ingrained quality is in the fabric of existence. These meats have more quality than those meats. A filet mignon is higher quality than a round steak. Grass-fed, ethically raised meat is high quality as opposed to factory farmed meat from animals who are tortured to death. That is very, very low quality, and that will be a topic of an upcoming video. But how this is any different from this essay has more quality than that essay. We already know quality creates the universe, so everything can be recognized as higher or lower quality. although this valuation is far from fixed, which is a lot of what this chapter is going to start alluding to. So which way was best to divide quality? Well, it turned out it wasn't the classic and romantic that he was trying to do in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, because the problem with that is it's still a dualism. You still have to fit everything into one category or the other. And it was a nice try, to put all the subjective stuff in the cutting edge of the train and all the objective stuff back in the boxcars, but it's still a dualism, even though that metaphor is still excellent. And this is going to be, and what he ends up doing is using that metaphor and really explaining it. And what you are doing is explaining how quality works. So you need to keep quality itself intact, so to speak. And thanks to Paul Go for that tip, that this is not a dualism. This is something else. When an American Indian goes into isolation and fasts in order to achieve a vision, the vision he seeks is not a romantic understanding of the surface beauty of the world, and neither is it a vision of the world's classic intellectual form. It is something else. So Pheadrus knows the vision quest is a manifestation of dynamic quality, which is ultimately what the Indians are seeking, that experience. After all, it is that experience that gave Pheadrus the best fact in his attempt at anthropology, and that fact came out of the blue. Again, Pirsig's metaphysical divide is not dualistic. It's the identification of, let's just say, a mechanism that drives all of reality. And this is what this chapter is going to explain, how he came across this mechanism, which you saw in chapter 8. It's dualistic in language only, and in typical Pirsigian way, he will talk us through understanding with excellent examples. So about the use of the word mechanism, right now it's the best word I can come up with to describe what we're talking about, as opposed to a dualism, because quality is a force. It's active. It's like Tao. And you can't say Tao is a thing or an experience. It's a noun, but it's not an object. Although it helps to create objects, and it's not defined as subjective, although you can sense it. It's something else. It's the way of the universe, and that's it. And Tao is probably the closest thing to quality that exists. But there's a critical difference between Tao and quality as framed by the metaphysics of quality, and that involves evolution. The cart is going somewhere. So let's go to the next section. So he comes across this description of the Zuni Indian misfit by Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist. The anecdote was a case history in which there was a conflict of morality. It concerned a Pueblo Indian who lived in Zuni, New Mexico in the 19th century. Like a Zen koan, which also originally meant case history, the anecdote didn't have any single right answer, but rather a number of possible meanings that kept drawing Pheadrus deeper and deeper into the moral situation that was involved. So I want to do a little segue here. What is a koan? Pirsig said it means a case history. What does that mean? Well, I found a very short blog on Medium, and I'm just going to read one paragraph out of it. I'll put a link to this blog. The Zen koan comes from the Chinese Kung An, meaning a public case, as in a legal matter brought before a judge. There are numerous ways in which these koan could be related to law cases. Very straightforwardly, these are public records, the recorded sayings of the early Chan masters that have been passed down and commented upon, just as there may be public legal cases that have authority as precedent and have been commented upon. The koan encounter could be understood as a judgment by a master on a student based on the student's understanding of a case. That's interesting. That clears that up. So now we get to this case history, and this is one because it is a case history of the metaphysics of quality in the real world, how it would work. This is a story of the renegade Zuni, the brujo, and that concept of the brujo here is one of the real clinchers in the book for me. This really captivated me. So I'm not going to rehash the whole story. I'm assuming you've read it. So let's go straight to what we learn about the brujo. Pirsig refers to him as a shaman. And first of all, Pirsig says of the priests that this brujo, the shaman, is counter to. Priests work in a rigorously structured hierarchy fixed in a firm set of traditions. And this is where their power comes from. It is a church bureaucracy, let's just say. So from the story, we can extract several characteristics of the brujo. He's an individualist. He's a threat to organized religion. Joan of Arc was a brujo. He's a threat to the system and therefore often persecuted. He's a real person who claims religious powers. He possesses unusual talents. In the case of this brujo, a sweet singing voice and expansive memory for songs and mythology of his tribe. He's an agent of change. He's following his own vague sense of betterness. He implements this betterness because he's compelled to. Ultimately, he breaks the power of the bureaucracy, and then he sticks with that updated system to implement the betterness, and that is how he becomes the governor in this anecdote. When Pheadrus first read this passage, he felt a kind of eerie feeling, a feeling he might have had if he had passed in front of a strange mirror and suddenly seen a reflection of someone he'd never expected to see. It was the same feeling he got at the peyote meeting. The Zuni Indian was not exactly someone else. Okay, so why does he feel this everyman connecting to this Zuni Indian? Because we've all been caught in this dilemma in which we're told what is good, but we know that there's something better, and we're stuck because we need to act on what we feel compelled to act on what's better, or it's nagging at us, but there are repercussions of acting on it. And those repercussions can be uncomfortable, or they can go all the way to dire. They can actually end up killing us. And if we act on what we know is better, we're going to face some real social problems. The story was of a struggle between good and evil, but the koan it raised was which was which. Was this person really good, or was he perhaps also evil? It became apparent there were two kinds of good and evil involved. Good and evil in this context revolve around tradition and change. Sometimes tradition is good when it's functioning, and to change it wouldn't make any sense. So anyone trying to come in and change something that works, trying to shake it up, that's probably not good. That's bad. What could you do? What could that do to a functional system? Say the barbarians invade your peaceful village. Are they good barbarians? No. Dragons are a symbol of this kind of evil. The barbaric force that comes in and chaotically destroys the order of your system in one fell swoop is dynamic evil. It's very, very low quality. But in the case of these Zuni villagers, it turns out that their system isn't really working because they're maintaining their old traditional way of life, and the white man has come in and he's part of the package now, and he's taking over. So they have two choices: stick with the system and ultimately be annihilated, or realize that survival depends on updating that system and working with the invaders, the white man. The people in Zuni know this, but it takes an outsider, a misfit, to really take action on that thing that's brewing in the tribe. And as we said, the outsider will ultimately become the center of the hierarchy. The chaos on the outskirts, this brujo stirring things up, ultimately supplants the priests. There's a static good that maintains order, values, laws, culture, and a dynamic good that is continually rediscovered that updates the static good, and they both need each other. So the cultural immune system described in Chapter 4 is a system that stays the same by force. It deliberately refuses to let in any agent of change. It continues to deliver the same message in order to preserve some kind of power or certainty, and that is static evil. So we have dynamic evil, which is too chaotic, and static evil, which is too rigid. But as we all know, there's a reason to want to kind of preserve that, because the human species has a fear of uncertainty. And uncertainty is a really big problem. And this is, if you're trying to overcome, your discomfort with uncertainty and allow for good things to come in when they need to, that's where all this meditative stuff can help, like the vision quest, psychedelics, and like he says in this chapter. The purpose of mystic meditation is not to remove oneself from experience, but to bring oneself closer to it by eliminating stale, confusing, static intellectual attachments of the past. So let's talk about something obvious: American politics. You have the political establishment consisting really of both Democrats and Republicans. You saw how many Republicans got behind Biden, in order to preserve the establishment against the chaotic upstart, Trump, the despised outsider shaking up the system and exposing the problems of the status quo, the cultural immune system. He's unearthing some of the secrets. And this is a pretty good example since this system is changing and we all know it. And I guess the question is, how are we going to use this shakeup to make things better than worse? Probably by learning we need some other choices besides these two guys, because Trump isn't exactly the brujo he could have been. He's actually involved in some bad static patterns taken from the corporate world. And remember, the brujo is directed by that dim apprehension of what's better. Trump already has a big business system. The only thing to really look at then is you've got these two systems, but one is coming in and shaking up the other. The systems themselves aren't so great, but the shakeup is what we're looking at. We're looking at that relationship between these two systems, one shaking up the other. It's what happens when you get a citizen who becomes a president, not a politician. I mean, it may have been very different if it wasn't Trump, but there still probably would have been something like this no matter what citizen we got as president. So it just happens that the system, you could call that the deep state if you want to, is being shook up by this brujo, so to speak, this person with brujo characteristics. He is a catalyst for change. There are some characteristics of the brujo that don't fit for Trump. For one thing, does he want what's better? Well, we're not necessarily sure about that. So maybe we can get some ideas of how to benefit from this shakeup as we go through the moral elements of the metaphysics quality coming up in this book. My personal belief is that maybe it's going to open up some other ways of governing that are not Republican and Democrat. There are certainly more obvious examples of renegades like this who really did propel in society in new ways, and you could argue that they were better ways because humanity did progress when the system was shaken up and finally settled into the new static patterns. Christ is obviously one of them, but Nietzsche, Freud, Elon Musk, Joe Rogan, all these people get a lot of flack at the beginning. Now, of course, you see these static patterns begin to form at a much more rapid rate than the past. The cycle is much faster now, and that's due to the fact that information transfers exponentially faster all the time. And things seem to be getting better in some ways, but worse in others. So certainly this should be a topic of discussion. And how are we going to integrate Pirsig's metaphysics quality into this? That's a good question. After many months of thinking about it, he was left with a reward of two terms, dynamic good and static good, which became the basic division of his emerging metaphysics of quality. So after reviewing this anecdote, this is how he was going to proceed, dynamic good and static good, and those are the ways the quality is characterized in the metaphysics of quality. So the other example Pirsig gives of the way quality works is with music. So you probably, again, have read that, so I'm just going to quickly summarize. You hear a new song, and it's amazing, and you finally figure out what it is, and you can't wait to buy it. So you play it and play it and play it until it gradually loses that special something, and it just isn't compelling anymore. But it becomes a classic in your music collection. The moment you hear that song, that's dynamic quality. You learn the name, and then you start, the rational life starts doing its work. You learn the name, you learn the artist, you buy it, and the more you play it, the more it becomes a fixed entity. So you put it away, and then you haul it out every now and then and play it for friends or for nostalgic purposes. But it will never have that same quality that it had when you first heard it. And the interesting thing that Pirsig points out is that that moment of dynamic quality, when you first hear the song, you are hyper aware of your surroundings. And when you think back to when you first heard that song, it's very clear where you heard it, what you were wearing, what the day was like. You really remember a lot of things. And that's because everything that was static is somehow, everything that you're used to somehow gets upended when you experience that moment of dynamic quality. So everything seems fresh around you. It's a really interesting thing Pirsig says about that. So think of this in times in your life. Think of the memories that really stand out. These are moments of pure dynamic quality, and there are tons of events and occurrences you don't remember in your life that are just mundane, rote, where you were just going through the same static patterns. But think of those dynamic moments. Think of your first kiss. Unless you were drunk, which might be the case, you can really remember just about everything about it. How old you were, what season it was, what you were thinking and feeling, how much taller he was than you, what he was wearing, what you were wearing, of course, what song was playing. Is it any wonder that wedding couples have their song, probably the song that they had their first kiss to, or whatever. And usually that song is the first dance they have as a married couple. The next example involves other situations that illustrate the moment of dynamic quality when your static patterns are demolished and all you have is that vibrant moment of quality. And in these moments, you feel alive. Even as in the case of the example, you've just suffered from a heart attack, or not in your safe suburban home with all its static comfort, but instead in a life-threatening hurricane. So think about COVID and how it transpired. If you work in a profession where you must interact with the public, then you are in chaos. You are in a dynamic, low-quality situation. If you can comfortably work at home, then the first weeks of the coronavirus being able to stay at home might have been novel and dynamic at the beginning, pretty cool. But now it has devolved into a cultural immune system that the state is enforcing. No wonder people in both camps, those who lost their jobs and those who have to work from home, are out protesting and even rioting. One group says, screw this, and is looking for new static patterns, and the other is rebelling like the brujo against this enforced way of life that we are really beginning to get tired of. Now, I understand we need to stay safe, but I'm just talking about how we're feeling. Anyway, Pheadrus has his division, and now he's showing us how it works. With quality divided into dynamic and static components, a way of approaching them emerges. It says Pirsig, which means you can actually start using it to understand the way of using a metaphysics, which obviously means how we are going to conceive of reality now. We're going to have a different conception of reality once we see it through the lens of the quality of the metaphysics quality. Remember the lens in the last chapter, he was pretty much using that to show how quality creates subjects and objects, but the lens of the metaphysics of quality, once you get into understanding this philosophy, the Pirsig's philosophy, the world is not going to look the same to you. So finally, there's a section, I love this section. This is where, again, he's going to explain how quality creates objects. And this is fascinating. This is a wonderful section. It's about the baby in the womb and then newly born. So that baby doesn't categorize the sensations in the womb. He has no categories at all, just the raw experience of dynamic quality. He just interacts with sensation, with whatever tools he's been given to experience sensation as a living entity, as a human being. Very primal. In fact, you could say it's as primal as any other creature in the womb. I don't know how the human brain reacts, but I think it's very inchoate. I think that's how you pronounce that word. From the baby's point of view, something, he knows not what, compels attention. This generalized something, Whitehead's dim apprehension, is dynamic quality. This goes back to an earlier observation by Pheadrus, so I'm going to read that quote. When A.N. Whitehead wrote that mankind is driven forward by dim apprehensions of things too obscure for its existing language, he was writing about dynamic quality. Dynamic quality is the pre-intellectual cutting edge of reality, the source of all things, completely simple and always new. Its only perceived good is freedom, very important, and its only perceived evil is static quality itself. Eventually the baby, with the help of his mother, and who for many months is not differentiated from his mother, as the seminal developmental psychologist D.W. Winnicott pointed out, there is no baby and mother. There's just one in the beginning of months. This is just you could, interestingly, the baby and mother working together as one unit is kind of like static and dynamic quality working together. That's just a thought. So the baby slowly begins to have his own perceptions, which are mirrored by the mother, which are helped develop by the mother. There's all this dynamic quality, and the mother is helping the baby to develop static patterns. So like I said, there's a interesting similarity between that relationship and the relationship of dynamic and static quality. So then that baby can begin to put these primary experiences into categories. And those primary experiences are undefined. They're dynamic sensations, but they come together as objects, with this mirroring by the mother and with experience in the world. And later, in a few months, he's going to learn that he himself is an object, and he is in fact separate from his mother. He has agency. And after this, it will be an ongoing continuation of this bottom-up perception and analog creation until he's been acclimated to society's understanding of objects. Soon the child can go with the perception of an object from 0 to 60. He doesn't have to go through the whole primal experience all the way through the mother's mirroring and societal influence to understand what that object is. The learning becomes a shorthand in the same way you don't learn how to ride a bicycle or brush your hair every time from scratch. You've already learned it. It becomes automatic. Our perception of objects is an automatic understanding of them, but there's a whole process behind them. They aren't just there in the world. So the kid is now, being taught this is a tree, this is a ball, this is a cat, and it's never questioned again. And that's how we come to understand objects. And as Robert tried to explain in Chapter 3 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, how we are hypnotized into believing these objects have always been there. But without the mother, without society, if he was abandoned in the forest and raised by wolves, what would this perception of objects be? It would not be the same as ours. Objects are not objective. They are agreed upon. But it is not until the baby is several months old that he will begin to really understand enough about this and that enormously complex correlation of sensations and boundaries and desires called an object to be able to reach for one. This object will not be a primary experience. It will be a complex pattern of static values derived from the primary experience. Like I said, you don't go through the primary experience and all that learning. You just go from 0 to 60. Object. Now we have to ask ourselves, how do we better perceive dynamic quality? Remember, this is a lot of the point of what I'm trying to do here, and I think we should if we're studying Pirsig, is because this is a better metaphysical system. We want to be closer to dynamic quality. We want to have more of that primal experience sometimes when we need to make things better. If we were to turn Pirsig's philosophy into a mode of living, or even a therapy, which I'm, of course, always looking to do, then we need to really take a look at this. His discussion of the baby is an example of primal experiences. Of course, that's what you're trying to achieve with Zen practice and the vision quest. So that's something else. Remember, the Indians were looking for something else. They weren't looking for classical understanding of the structure, romantic understanding either. They were looking for something else, and that is to get in touch with the supreme being or dynamic quality. American Indians are exceptionally skilled at holding the ever-changing center of things. That is the real reason they speak and act without ornamentation. It violates their mystic unity. And this, of course, illustrates the universality of the mystical experience, which makes total sense since dynamic quality is the essence of reality. And it also makes sense that it's very difficult to differentiate God from quality, in my opinion. I think maybe some people would disagree, but I certainly have a hard time differentiating it, and I don't think I even have to, or we even should even think about that. Same way we probably shouldn't think about consciousness. This moving and acting and talking in accord with the Great Spirit and almost nothing else has been the ancient center of their lives. But what of static quality? Certainly, when viewed on their own, static patterns seem dead, and that's what Pheadrus thought for a long time, just like the scientific approach of subject-object metaphysics. But without static quality, that quality we feel, that betterness, is just ephemeral, or it's even chaotic. Although dynamic quality, the quality of freedom, creates this world in which we live, these patterns of static quality, the quality of order, preserve our world. Neither static nor dynamic quality can survive without the other. So let's look at one last quote from earlier in this chapter about the song, which gives us a taste of where we're going with this. You will come to see that the same kind of division between dynamic quality and static quality that exists in the fields of morals, which would be the zuni story, also exists in the field of art, which would be the song story. So the record story shows us the role of dynamic quality in art. The brujo story shows us the role of that mechanism in the realm of morals. No longer are we looking at subjects and objects as a way of understanding. It is confounding to try to evaluate morals in art in that way. But through the lens of metaphysical quality, it's an entirely different thing. We can see the mechanism, that relationship between static and dynamic quality that inspires, produces, and helps us use these static patterns. So now as the book goes along, Pirsig is going to help us understanding those static patterns. This is a system that not only helps us understand morals, art, science, evolution, and the universe, but ties them neatly together. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.